They gathered in the dark, bare feet pressed into earth, eyes watching the fire, always the fire. Their bodies were lean, scarred, alive with instinct. They spoke no words, but they hunted, they danced, they remembered. Before history, there was only survival. Before there was history, before words carved truth into stone, there was only silence and survival. In the heart of East Africa, under the red morning sun, the first humans opened their eyes, fragile, uncertain, and utterly alone. They weren't strong, they didn't have claws or fangs, but in their hands they held something new, a chipped stone, shaped with purpose, a tool, a beginning. Every breath was earned, every shadow could be death. Yet from those primal nights, firelight flickered, and with it came the first sparks of memory. They watched the stars, not with wonder, but with fear. What moved above, what crept in the dark, shaped how they moved, where they slept, and what they dreamed. Then came change, taller, bolder. Homo erectus. They stood upright, not just to see but to go, and they did, across deserts, through forests, into the unknown. They lit torches in places no human had stood. They crossed rivers with no bridge, climbed mountains with no names, and still they kept going. When the cold came, they built shelters from bone and hide. When beasts roamed, they sharpened spears, but when a child died, they cried and buried them with flowers. They painted hands on cave walls, not to mark territory, but to say, we were here, we saw, we felt. Their echoes still linger in stone and silence. They met others not like them, broader, stronger, Neanderthals. In the frozen caves of the north, a silent tension grew, and eventually only one remained. And so, from dust and fear, from fire and flight, rose the species we are. Not because we were the strongest, but because we remembered, and we endured. They did not live in palaces, nor temples. Their shelter was what nature gave, and what their hands could shape. A cave, a hollow tree, a hut of bone and mud. Caves weren't just shelter. They were memory. Each wall recorded storms, hunts, births, deaths. Their soot and symbols became the first stories ever told. Near rivers, they built camps. Where water flowed, so did life. Fish, clay, warmth. They learned to read the sound of the current, as others read scripture. They stayed where food stayed. Herds, roots, berries. When the animals moved, they moved. The land wasn't theirs, they belonged to it. In cold regions, they dug into snow and bone. In forests, they bent trees into walls. In heat, they slept beneath the earth. They did not conquer nature, they adapted to it. Each shelter told who they were. A hunter's camp smelled of blood and smoke. A healer's corner had herbs, bones, and silence. Every place held a soul. They watched the stars from cracks in their ceilings. They listened to wind whistle through bones. And in their sleep, they dreamed not of comfort, but of surviving tomorrow. Walls meant more than protection. They meant presence. A circle of stones, a ring of sticks. They said someone lived here. And one day, someone will remember. In their homes, there were no kings, no thrones, only shared warmth, shared meat, and shared fear of the dark. That was their unity. That was their kingdom. And when a child was born, they celebrated not with songs, but with fire and silence. Another voice for the wind, another breath for the earth. They ate what they could find, roots, berries, insects, but those were fleeting. To thrive, they had to chase what could run and bleed. The hunt was never quiet. It was fast, brutal, desperate. Spears weren't thrown for glory. They were thrown to keep children from starving. They watched animals for days, learned their paths, their sounds, their fears. Strategy was born not from strength, but from patience. Fire changed everything. It made meat last longer, taste better. It let them cook stories into food and warmth into memory. Some chased mammoths, others tracked deer. In swamps, they fished with spears. In forests, they set traps. Every land taught its own menu. They shared what they had. The old were fed first. The wounded received the best cuts. Even in hunger, they remembered compassion. Bones weren't waste. They became knives, needles, even flutes. Nothing was thrown away because nothing came easy. Sometimes they failed. The animal escaped, the river dried, and hunger returned like a ghost. But they did not surrender. They moved on. The hunt wasn't just for meat. It was for meaning, for rhythm, for the ancient dance between hunger and hope. And so each meal was more than food. It was memory. It was survival made sacred. In every bite, a story older than time. They were more than hunters and gatherers. They were brothers, sisters, mothers, fathers. Their families were their shelters long before stone or fire. A child was raised not by two, but by many. Elders taught by fire, youth watched the hunt, mothers healed with hands worn by time. There were no written laws, but there were unspoken roles. The strong hunted, the wise remembered, the quiet listened, and the group endured. Leadership wasn't taken, it was earned. Through scars, through stories. The leader wasn't loudest, but the one most others trusted in silence. Arguments came like storms, fast, sharp, but rarely did they last. For in the wild, unity was not choice, it was survival. The young were never alone, older siblings carried them. Elders sang to them. Even in hardship, no one walked unseen. They laughed, not often, but honestly. Around fires after danger passed, stories filled the night. Stories not for fun, but for remembering. Birth was sacred, death was quieter. A whisper, a stone placed gently, a look passed from one heart to another. Grief, though silent, was shared. They didn't say I love you, but they stayed. They fought for each other. They carried the wounded, and they waited for the slow. Family wasn't just blood, it was fire shared. It was stories passed. It was shoulders beside you when the night grew cold and the world felt too wide. Before words, there were looks, a flick of the eyes, a nod toward danger. Their language was silence sharpened by instinct. They used hands like we use songs, to welcome, to warn, to promise. Every gesture was a bridge across the unknown. Sounds came later, not sentences but signals. A grunt for danger, a hum for approval, a hiss to stay low, meaning woven into breath. Their mouths shaped rhythm before they shaped thought. Repeated sounds became memory. Repetition became power. The first syllables were survival. From calls in the hunt to songs by the fire, sound became soul. The first languages weren't taught, they were felt. They named what mattered. Fire, water, sky, child. These weren't just words, they were spells. To speak a thing was to honor it. Words made memory portable. One voice could carry a storm. Another could carry a legend. The tribe began to remember together. The walls of caves echoed the first stories. Symbols became ideas. Paint became prophecy. They learned to speak without speaking. A gesture could save a life. A word could start a war. They discovered language was not only power, it was responsibility. And so from lips and lungs and longing, they spoke. Not just to survive, but to be remembered. And now we speak, because they first whispered. When thunder shook the sky, they didn't run. They bowed. They listened. They believed something greater was watching, even if they had no name for it. They feared what they couldn't see. A shadow in the cave, a cry in the wind. These were not just dangers, they were omens. When someone died, they didn't vanish. They became smoke, stone, memory. Their body returned to the earth, but their spirit stayed by the fire. Bones were not bones, they were relics, symbols. The curved horn, the painted skull, the perfect shell, each held the weight of meaning. They painted creatures not to admire, but to ask, for strength, for mercy, for survival. A bison on the wall was a prayer in ochre. They lit fires not just to warm, but to guide. Flames told the dead where to walk. Smoke carried messages into the dark sky. Some danced, others hummed, some carved spirals into stone. These weren't decorations. These were offerings to the unseen, to the unknown. They wore masks made of bone, painted their faces with ash, not to scare, but to become something else. Something beyond human. Every full moon they gathered, not to celebrate, but to ask, will the hunt return? Will the child heal? Will the sun rise again? And when the stars were right, they whispered to them. Not in words, but in longing. The first prayers were not spoken. They were felt. They wore the world. Fur for warmth, bones for memory, feathers for dreams. Every piece meant something or protected them from something unseen. A hunter wore claws of his prey. A mother wore a stone from her first fire. Their bodies became altars of memory. They didn't wear clothes, they wore stories. A broken tooth, a carved bead, a strip of red ochre across the chest, all spoken without sound. Some painted their bodies for war, others for birth. Each color carried a voice, the yellow of sun, the red of blood, the black of the unknown. Children were marked with charcoal circles. Elders wore spirals tattooed with bone needles. They didn't fear pain, they feared forgetting. Masks were not disguises, they were transformations. A wolf, a bird, a spirit. When the mask came on, the man became more than man. Bracelets from vines, anklets made of shells. They echoed when they walked, each step a rhythm, a signal, a reminder. You are not alone. The body was a canvas, a declaration of place, power, purpose. From toe to temple they carved their truths into skin and stone. Not all wore the same. The elder carried silence, the hunter wore wind, the child wore nothing but awe. Identity was not hidden, it was lived. And so long before mirrors, they dressed to remember, to become, to speak. Their clothing was their voice, their body, their story. They had no paper, no brushes, but still they created. Because inside them was something louder than silence, something that begged to be seen. They drew what they feared and what they loved, the hunt, the storm, the birth, the loss, each line a prayer, each figure a memory. They sang, not in melody, but in rhythm, the beat of wood on stone, the hum in the throat. The body became drum, and the soul danced. A carved line on a bone was not decoration. It was a calendar, a memory, a warning. Art, for them, was not beauty, it was survival. Children learned to draw before they spoke. They smeared red across stone, copying the elder's hand. Their first stories weren't told, they were painted. They carved flutes from bird bones, simple, hollow, pure. When blown, it sounded like breath, like longing, music before language. Some etched spirals into stone, others pressed fingers into clay. Shapes echoed dreams, and dreams became tradition. To them, creation wasn't separate from life. The hunt was art, the fire was song, the burial was poetry without words. They didn't need applause or fame. Their art was for the wind, the fire, and the unborn. For those yet to remember them. And now, when we stand in silence before their painted walls, we see them. Not as beasts, but as dreamers, as the first artists of the earth. At first there were no enemies, just strangers. But when two groups wanted the same fire, the same river, blood followed. Conflict wasn't chosen, it was inherited. When resources thinned, when hunger returned, survival turned against its own reflection. They didn't build armies, just formed circles, shielded the young, held stones tighter, and waited for first blood to fall. A strike wasn't just pain, it was memory, a scar that outlived the wound. From that pain came stories of revenge. Weapons evolved, spears became sharper, clubs heavier, traps crueler. The hand that once painted dreams now carved into flesh. Victory was not glory, it was grief. The fallen were kin. Sometimes even the enemy's face looked too familiar. But even in conflict, rules were born. The weak were spared. The fire was never poisoned. A code formed, not from law, but from survival. They learned when to fight and when to walk away. Not every enemy had to fall. Some simply had to understand. Scars remained, not just on skin, but in fire songs. Children asked, "Why did Uncle not return?" And silence answered. And so the first wars were not wars, they were mirrors. Pain meeting pain, fear facing fear. And through that fire came wisdom. They didn't move for glory. They moved because the rains stopped, because the mammoths vanished, because the land grew quiet. They crossed mountains without names, walked through snow they had never felt. But still they walked, barefoot, breathless, driven by need. Some reached deserts, sand cut their eyes, heat bent their bones, but where one fell, another lifted. They learned, the earth does not pity. They rafted across rivers on logs, some never returned. Others drifted into new lands, not knowing if they had arrived or simply survived. They carried no maps, only stories. The stars were their ceiling, the wind their compass, and memory their only guide. New lands brought new dangers, forests with silent predators, rivers with hidden teeth, but they listened, adapted, endured. They learned to read footprints, to follow birds, to smell the wind. Survival was not strength, it was awareness. In every new place, they planted fire, drew stories on stone, named the land with breath and blood. Every arrival was a quiet victory. Some never stopped walking, their bones scattered across continents, their footprints washed by oceans. But the path remained, and from those who moved we came. Each step they took became a future, and now we live where their shadows once fell. Before us there were others, not beasts, not less, just different. Their stories are carved in bone, not books. Neanderthals. Broad, strong, thoughtful, they buried their dead, cared for the injured, and painted in caves long before we did. They lived in the cold, adapted to snow and silence, built homes of bone and hide, and vanished without a clear goodbye. But they didn't disappear. Part of them lives on, in us. Every breath we take may echo theirs. Then there were the Denisovans, found not in paintings but in DNA. Silent giants of the East, their bones whisper through time. We never saw their faces, only a finger, a tooth, a gene. But from that, we learned they once walked among us. And others, unknown, unnamed, left behind tools but no bones, songs but no voice, footprints without a face. Some groups vanished in fire, others in ice, but their wisdom lives in stone circles, sky maps, and the way we still stare at the stars. We weren't the only people, just the last ones left. And even now, we're not alone in what they gave us. So when you look in the mirror, remember, you carry echoes of many people, of many worlds, and many forgotten names. They left no books, but the land remembers in bones, in charcoal, in silence where laughter once lived. They walked in fear, but also in wonder. With each fire lit, they pushed back the dark, not just outside, but within. They died nameless, but not meaningless. For every tool they carved, we carved a future. We live in their dreams, their shelters became cities, their fears became myths, their hopes became us. They spoke in gesture, we speak in satellites. But our questions remain the same. Who are we? Why are we here? We remember them in stories, not to worship the past, but to honor the path that brought us here. They taught us that life is not just survival, it's ritual, it's rhythm, it's meaning found in the smallest flame. Our DNA is a song, sung by thousands of voices before us, each note an ancestor, each chord a world. So light the fire, walk the path, carve your mark. You are not the end, you are the echo. This was not just a story of the past, it was a mirror, and in that mirror you saw a flicker of something ancient, still burning.